Hello, book lovers. It is Phil Svitek and Marisa Serafini back for the February edition of our online book club. There's no official title. We just read books, then we talk about them. Hopefully, you enjoy it. We get your recommendations. Eventually, we'll get to them. So yeah, we pick a book each month to read and discuss. So that's the bulk of the episode. But then at the end, we'll also talk about books that we're reading off the curriculum as well. So you can look forward to that. In the February edition, we are reading The Earth of Mankind. Well, technically, we've already read, because it wouldn't be a fun discussion if we were just speculating. So it is spoiler filled. And this is a very interesting book. It is written by Pramoedya Ananta Toer. And that is the only time I'm even going to try to pronounce it. I'm just going to call him Pram. It's a very fascinating book, which we'll get into the kind of history and its significance because it is a banned book. So this is not in the US, luckily, not yet, but in other parts of the world it has been banned. So we'll talk about that. But without further ado, let me kick it to you, Marissa. This was my pick, so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on my choice.
Yeah, I think I messaged you and I was like, here I go. Wish me luck. Kind of knowing what I was getting myself into. And, the first 50 pages, I was like, all right, I like this guy's mentality. I like how he's thinking. And then, reading it and just like the whole dual aspect of how he kind of lives his life. And we'll definitely get more into it. But the way he goes about things versus the way people see him and like the belief system that he's set up to. He lives his life contradictorily. And it's very at first that was interesting. And then like as I kept reading, I was like, oh, okay, this is the entire book. It's just like him fighting against all these obstacles that are constantly against him. And then it felt like at some points it got repetitive, but it was very interesting to see like how other cultures view different countries, and discrimination is still like a very universal thing. Despite your backgrounds or despite whatever education or accomplishments you get in life, people still view you a certain way, just based on like tradition and culture. So I think that was interesting because that's still a universal thing that goes on and everyone can still relate to that somehow.
Yeah, absolutely. And taking kind of quick step back, so the main character is named Minky, and it's told in the first person, and he literally opens up saying, "My name's not important, so here's what we're going to call me," which translated means monkey. And it takes place in Indonesia under the sort of Dutch rule at the time. And the duality that you're talking about is obviously he's not Dutch, but because he's privileged enough to have a higher form of education, he's not looked on by the locals as being one of them either. So he's in this weird no man's land and trying to fit into either or. And there's of course a love story, a tragic love story in a lot of ways, which we'll talk about. But I want to set the tone. I don't want to quite dive into the author's background fully, but as a nice tease, this was verbally told to people in jail while he was in jail, and it had to be transcribed. So the fact that like this is coherent in any way,
Mhm.
because I mean, writing a book is hard enough. Telling it to somebody and then essentially entrusting them that like somehow it will be written down in the form that which you are talking about, uh, seems like a big leap of faith. So, yeah, in many ways, I feel like it's a miracle that this got written in the way that it did. So kudos there. But yeah, let's talk. I mean, a lot to sort of dive into, but I guess I'm curious because overall, the love story, not that it's the central theme, but it's the central theme. It progresses the story most of all, let's say. So, thoughts on that?
Well, you know me, I love a good romantic love story. And I think it showed like a nice, I guess, I mean, when you add a female to it, like there's a maternal aspect too, um, and a more nurturing aspect that we were lacking for a long time in the book until the woman comes into the picture. And when she comes into the picture, I loved when from the get-go she was supportive of him no matter what, his name, his background, his education, all of his accomplishments. She had this public respect and she was already like praising him openly in front of everyone. And so that already like set the bar high for her. I was like, all right, I like this woman. And she supported him at all facets of the life or like once they got together, and I loved it. It was very consistent, and that was a support system that I didn't, or like we were lacking from some of his family, his friends, and his people that he was working with. But to have someone constantly like in his corner rooting for him, I enjoyed that.
What do you think about like the meet cute of it all? Meaning, so, he has this crush on the queen, the most gorgeous woman he's ever seen. And then someone essentially tells him, listen, there's a woman even more beautiful. And and then here he finds her.
Yeah, I mean it's great because it shows like yeah, you can have your regular crushes aside from, just like wanting and like admiring from afar, but when I think it's like when you finally meet someone just whoever despite it's not your crush or the first person you were thinking of, I think it's like when you meet them actually in person and find their personalities, like that can supersede everything else you were like looking towards someone else, you know? Um, and I enjoyed that, meet cutes. I mean, or just like I loved how they started. That was a great start to their relationship.
Well, not so much a great end. And I think
Oh,
what I appreciate about it is that the ending essentially is twofold in terms of tragic, right? So there's the aspect with our main character, Minky. Um, his marriage to Annalise is essentially null and void. They don't believe it because, it's not honored by Dutch law. Therefore, it's illegitimate. And furthermore, her mom, Naya, who's essentially quite literally sacrificed so many things to try to give her daughter this good life
mhm.
through just circumstance of just, the Dutch colonizers essentially, they're like, no, you're not going to have that. In fact, we're going to break you guys up and you're going to come here and you're going to do essentially what your mom did, which is be a concubine. And that's your life now, you know?
Yeah, and it's always fortunate because, here in America we have our freedom. We're like, F that, we're not gonna do that. But, in some countries, especially Indonesia at the time, it's just like that was the norm. That was expected of them. And it's really unfortunate when people in that position, like Annalise, is like, do you just accept? I don't want to say this terribly, but it's like accept your fate because this is what you were like meant to do anyways. This is expected of you. This is expected of the women in our culture. So like, why are you trying to fight against it? It's like your mother was doing it and now you're doing it. It's like, why is this a surprise? And it's very frustrating reading it from a different country, different nationality where our customs aren't that strict.
Well, I think that's also a central part of why the story got written to show sort of inhumanity, right? I mean, it's called The Earth of Mankind, and this is how mankind is treating other people, right? And in many ways, Naya, the mom, I mean, yes, that's sort of the way it was, but with her daughter, the idea was like the promise of a better life for my daughter. And in the blink of an eye, that just goes away. So not only does Minky, our protagonist, lose out on the love of his life, the entire sacrifice of what this mom was trying to fight for goes out the window for her
Yeah.
daughter, right? Like just, that's why I call it like a double, it's twofold. It's, it's a tragedy on all fronts. Um,
Yeah, it's like you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. And like you feel bad for the mother because she worked so hard. And then to have that ripped away from her daughter, like this chance that she could have had a better, more prosperous life than what the mother does. I mean, I think that's any like parent's wish, hopefully, for their kids that they work hard enough that their kids can have a different type of lifestyle. And when there was the promise and the glimpse of that she might have a better life and that's taken away, yeah, that's frustrating. That's awful. You don't want that for your child. And you don't want that for your quote unquote your son-in-law um to like tear apart a relationship just because someone doesn't recognize it legally.
Yeah, and and it's not just legally, like, well, it is of course legally, but the part of why it wasn't legal is because of the sort of religious nature. It wasn't done according to how the Dutch would do it. Therefore, like it's essentially writing
Yeah.
off their entire culture, their entire religion, and saying, "Oh, listen, if you wanted to have gotten married, you should have done it like this because the way you guys did it is some BS."
Right.
And again, that's just another sort of form of, they call it oppression, just any sort of, when you're dealing with colonizers and the people that are colonized, it's not very fair.
No, it's not. And to pass on that mentality, like, no, this isn't the way that we recognize it. This isn't the way we would have gone about it. Therefore, the way you did it is wrong. That projection kind of aspect, like that sucks for those two because it is love. It is based on like they did it in the way that they believed was the correct way to go about their marriage, even though it wasn't in the ideal way that they'd be recognized.
Yeah, and you sort of look at it, and I mean, if anything, they did it in the way that honored their love, and you can call it pure and things like that because it was for them. Like they weren't trying to be harmful to anybody else. They were just trying to, find happiness under the current circumstances. And yeah, that wasn't honored,
Yeah.
whatsoever. And I think that's, when I look at a book like this, I think it is important to read, because in many ways, right, not to get like too overly didactic about it, but there is a side of it, we like, if you take freedom for granted, it will leave you, right? And so seeing, other aspects of life and being able to tell warning signs and things like that. And, essentially, if you want freedom, you have to be an active participant in that freedom, and so I think it's definitely a good reminder of, what could be versus what is, and to tread light, to carefully.
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely.
um, what did you think of, let's talk about Naya and her relationship with Herman. So Herman is the Dutch colonizer. He owns, all of this. Naya is his concubine. So, just kind of curious on your thoughts, since he's not, I wouldn't call him an antagonist, but he's an antagonary figure, if that's even a
Yeah,
term.
he's definitely a foil. At first I wasn't sure about him because I mean, he clearly has like a bunch of different interests, quote unquote. But also like he treated Minky in like certain ways. He was kind of like, I guess you can say like two-faced a little bit. Like he would treat him one way and then treat him another way. And I didn't like it. I wasn't sure if I could trust him or not. And just the way like he treated the women and he versus treated Minky. I was like, I don't know if I'm supposed to like you or if I'm supposed to support you because he was very up in the air for me. Um yeah, and I still question him at the end of this. No, I didn't overall I didn't like him for what he made Minky go through, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, I think it's a deliberate choice, because sometimes, when oftentimes when you write, let's say, a story about good and evil, I'm not saying this is one of those 100%, but it's like in Lord of the Rings, okay, Sauron is evil. Cool, got it. And it's just,
Hmm.
there's no nuance to it. Whereas in real life, a lot of people who commit heinous acts, um, there's also a very good side to them. Like they can be charismatic, they can be X, Y, and Z. In Another Round, this movie, um, they sort of joked about like, hey, who would you vote for president? A guy who sleeps in, gets drunk, or one who loves all dogs and doesn't get drunk? Like the guy who doesn't get drunk. And it's like, great, you just voted for Hitler. you know?
Right.
So it's, yeah, it's that sort of confronting, the nature and how do you make that determination of what's right and what's wrong, aspect of it all.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, but like even as much as we didn't like Herman, still at the end they acknowledge the family, right? Correct?
Mhm.
Yes. The children, right? Um and like so for him to believe that the children are legitimate, I was like, okay, there there's a saving grace there, I guess you can say.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I mean, it's tough to. That's what makes it so frustrating. It's, like to make a pros and cons sheet of like him as a character.
He split.
We could really go and it's like, how do you determine this? Like, what teeters it from? Okay, he's a heinous human being to okay, he's actually good, but just done some bad stuff. You know?
Right. And this is why I say I was like, it's kind of too two-faced a little bit. Like you did some good, but you also did some bad. You're not an angel, but you're also not quite the devil either. Um, so I don't know. There were some redeeming qualities, but overall not the best.
Yeah,
Not
and
the best
certainly,
male.
certainly, like all this is sort of a backdrop, right? But the idea that um, this is how kind of things were. And I don't know, at least for me, I question and then kind of consider of like, okay, well, what was his upbringing, right? And like, according to, the Dutch, whatever ideology, like this is all totally fine, right? Obviously, we've talked about the legal aspects of it. So by its very nature, it's as a person, you'd be sort of hard pressed to think you're doing anything wrong if you're doing everything legally. It doesn't make it correct,
Hmm.
as we know throughout history, but that is the sort of hard barometer of like, wait, but I'm not doing anything wrong because I'm not, So, but that is the hard part of it.
Yeah. But I think it's interesting to have another male figure that goes against, I mean, unfortunately in the story Minky goes up against a lot of different type of male figures, and he's like the Hellman was like the first person who like really made us like, oh, if you're getting this within your family, your quote unquote family, internal family, like who else is going to do this to you outside of your inner circle? um, and so like that's what I'm saying is like Minky had constant obstacles in his way throughout this entire book.
Yeah, 100%. And sort of, let's talk about his writing because it's obviously analogous to the author himself because, he is a writer and, in many ways he was a political writer and things like that. And, that's why he ended up in prison is because he wrote some stuff that people didn't like,
Yeah,
for just telling essentially the truth. And
that's
so,
usually how it goes.
yes, it is. And so in this case, yeah, he let his writing sort of be an outlet and let it sort of shine. And, that's part of what helped him come to his confidence, if you will, at least to some degree, maybe not fully. So I want to, yeah, tell me your thoughts about his writing.
Yeah. I loved, when I first delved into the book, it gives you the forewarning, like, hey, this isn't written word for word. This is told orally, passed down. So things are going to get like maybe not lost in translation, but things are going to get like mixed up in interpretations, language barriers, and all that. So like I went in knowing that. Um, but reading it and the narrative, I still understood what he said. I still felt what he felt in all these situations, whenever he was being judged by someone or something was happening, like I felt like I was right there with him. And I felt frustrated when he was frustrated, felt angry and sad when he felt those emotions. And it kind of reminded me of another book that we read. You might remember it, the Jerry Conlon and the Gilded Brothers, who, um they went to prison wrongfully for murders, but like that book was so detailed, and despite all the emotional duress that that person was under, you could still like recall all the memories and situations as if it just happened. And I felt like there was the same type of writing for like orally passed on story like this, that I felt like I was there because, memories are created when you're emotionally heightened. And it felt like for this author that was probably how he remembers everything that happened to him in such great detail, because it was so emotionally, you know, hard hitting for him. Um, and as a human, I was like, I think that's, I don't want to say admirable, but like I applaud him for everything he went through, but still be able to tell it so eloquently.
Yeah, I mean, it's like they say, happiness is a form of resistance. And I'm not saying that, he was happy, but like in this sense, his writing was the form of resistance, right? And um, even obviously, this is a book that it's translated, and so a lot of the local dialect, um, gets a little bit lost for the purposes of translation. But as you're saying, it's in service of something, so it's okay in that way. But yeah, and the fact that he put like you can tell that the author is very much a part of this. Like you can see him and Minky in that way, just given the love of writing, right? And how that is just so core to what he's going for, you know. And he says a lot without ultimately, it's a lot of showing but not telling, and yet you
Yeah.
still end up seeing so much, right? As far as like the educational system, obviously how just all of the society just works, and the justices and injustices therein, I
Right.
appreciate that.
And especially Minky being an educated person and having the self-awareness that he's like, hey, I have the skills set and the tools to actually tell this story in an educated way and inform people what's happening, and have a reasonable opinion behind everything I'm saying. And so he used the means to get this story out. Um, Knowing that if, God forbid, this happened to one of his peers who's less educated or something, it probably would have been like, looked over and or like swept under the rug. Whereas it's like, no, 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 I can tell this story. People need to know this story. And if someone can get something out of this, then I did my job.
Exactly, and that's what like sometimes people look at just art in general as a selfish thing, and it's like, yes, you may be telling a very personal story, but that doesn't make it inherently uh, selfish, right? So,
Right.
100%, even though it's his story in obviously fictionalized, it extracts the stories of all of them, right? And what's going on and not going on. So, 100%. Anything else, story-wise you want to talk about versus, getting more into the background of the writer himself?
I think it was very interesting. The whole, what would you call it, like trial kind of like, um, I don't even know what you would call it, like trial arraignment. This when they kind of quote unquote kidnapped him in the middle of the night, didn't tell him where they were taking him, just to be questioned by his father of all people, be, and then be doubted upon by everyone in like the father's peers and all that, and just like, yes, you're educated, but also you're like, we see you as a native, or but you have the mentality and ideologies of a European, so where do you stand? And I think that was more frustrating, like, well, why did you bring me here just so you had me explain everything if you didn't like what I had to say? And I feel like we get a lot of those situations anywhere. Um, and that's where persecution happens. It's like, yeah, he got summoned, but then you didn't like what he had to say, so why are you angry?
Yeah, I mean, that sort of, I took the ending as, it kind of violence erupts, right, as things are happening. And I got the sense that by the end, Minky sort of resigned that any peace could ever be a possibility here, right? Like they
Hmm.
just see each other as two different, and that's the way it's going to be, as opposed to actually working towards something. Um, and that's what makes this all really, really tragic. You know, like there's no,
Yeah.
there's not a lot of hope in this book, I don't feel like.
Tragic and frustrating because it's also like Miki does such a great job of educating himself, going through all this work, trying to make himself a better person. And he actually has the patience to learn like different cultures and different mentalities and viewpoints and stuff. And then he was still, damned at the end of it, where people still won't want to believe him because they don't want to evolve with the times, changing their ways, because they're so set in their ways. Like, no, 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 this isn't how we like it, so you're still wrong. Despite everything that you just did and what you learned and stuff. And like, that's so frustrating. You see that with you see that in politics, you see that with different generational, how they view other people. It's just like, when you're up against people who won't change their ways or change their mindset, it's kind of a losing battle.
Yeah, 100%. Not even that. It's a losing battle in the worst of ways, like with the worst of stakes, you know?
Mhm.
Um, quite right. All right. Well, let's talk about I'm going to call him Pram because that's a lot easier.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
um, the good news, kind of, uh, he was born in February. I was going to say something cute, but we're doing this in February. He was born in February. He was born February 6th, 1925. You don't see that day uh, all the time.
No.
Sadly, he passed away April 30th of 2006. Um, he does hail from Indonesia, and he is a writer. He, survived the Dutch rule and Indonesia's struggle for occupation by Japan during the Second World War, as well as the post-colonial authoritarian regimes, and so forth. So he's lived through very tumultuous times. Um, and his writing favors out of favor, colonial and later authoritarian regimes that were in power. And as one might imagine, as we've hinted at, he faced a lot of censorship. And initially, he was imprisoned from 1947 to 1949, which was during the War of their Independence. Then, yet again, he was imprisoned from 1969 to 1979 um, because they branded him as a communist. And this is actually where he wrote the book, right? And when I say wrote the book, he was not permitted access to writing materials, so he recited it to other prisoners who would then write it down and smuggle it out of prison. So this was like Shawshank Redemption style storytelling.
Well, good for him.
Absolutely. And it is part of the Buru Quartet. Obviously, we haven't read the rest of them, but it seems quite interesting and so forth. So, yeah, sadly, he spent a lot of time in jail, but luckily, people, when we talk about like him having wrote this and having gone out, like by the time the book was like essentially banned from Indonesia in 1981. At that point, it already been printed in 33 languages across the world. So,
Too late.
quite a quite a success story in that way. So yeah, that's to be commended in many ways. Like I don't even know how that happens, but obviously it happened. So
Yeah, and it's just frustrating that they're like he got imprisoned twice. Like the first time was for one way, and unfortunately that was closer to another war that we all know of, World War II, and we know Europe went through tumultuous times for that, and it's just kind of unfortunate that maybe just us and as Americans and just my ignorance growing up, like I wasn't exposed to the Indonesian Dutch mentality and that culture. So like had I not read this book, I would not have known about that because you think the 1940s immediately going to think World War II. You're not going to think about all the other countries that were also dealing with their own personal wars in that way. Um
Let me tell
and
you, the Dutch colonized a lot of people. You know,
yeah,
you got Indonesia all the way over to like Aruba.
yeah,
So,
and unfortunately, like, but they don't teach that in American history. They don't teach that in our schools, you know? So, I mean, like, at least not the school that I went to. So it's stuff like this, whereas if we had not read this book, I would not also have known that for the most part. It's not in the, the mainstream education. So I think it's something that could be easily overlooked. And then, I think the Communist Party was a bigger, more worldwide spread thing. So to be labeled that as well, that's just like a whole nother thing, another set of problems. So like, all right, we got you for one thing, now we're gonna get you for something else. It's just
and that
like
was the
again with the
default too,
obstacles. Yeah, it's
right?
just the obstacles.
Like with McCarthyism, like, sure, some people were communists, but doesn't mean they all were communists. But it's like, oh, if you
Right.
disagree, oh, you're a communist. It just becomes this. And I think that speaks to what we're sort of talking about is, people just want easy labels. And so, in the book, it's like, hey, are you one of us or are you one of the Dutch? It's like, well,
Yeah.
technically I'm neither. So what label am I supposed to be? And so in that way, yeah, I think people just want easy fitting things in life. And it's like, that's not how things should be or how they actually are.
Right. And not everything is black and white. And Minky lived in the gray. And I think that that was his whole entire issue is that like I mean he couldn't, it's not necessarily like code switch, but it's also he was multiple things. You can't just be one thing or the other.
Yeah.
And I think like that people didn't understand that. People still don't understand that.
Yeah. And I think, we've sort of uh in sort of in the jest that we can with it, we sort of joke like books outside of the US, they tend to be a lot about colonizers. It's like, well, that's because it's their experience, like what else are they
Yeah.
supposed to write about? Like, they don't have all the fun stuff that, necessarily. And I'm sure they do, but for a majority of countries, like that is their lived experience. And so
That's their
that's their way
history.
of processing, and so forth, catharsis, hopefully, and whatnot. And some have gotten away from it, but there's still, believe it or not, colonizers out there. You
Yeah.
know, it ain't over. So it's just the reality of it. But yeah, so truly do appreciate though that the story got out there because man, that's quite the miracle. And in fact, so just to kind of give a little bit more of the history, so um, after being released in the former editor of the Eastern Star had met with Pram, and that's kind of what allowed them to get the works out there, and so it was chosen to really be published, and he gave him the rights to do so and so forth, and so yeah, during the time of 1980 to 1981, they hit that printing publishing real quick. Um, So, yeah, that's what made it sort of 5,000 copies of This Earth of Mankind sold in the space of 12 days. Um,
Wow.
in like in Hong Kong, Malaysia, Netherlands, and Australia. So that's, I can't imagine there was a lot of marketing for it. So to sell that many copies is actually, in the span of 12 days is, really quite good.
Right.
And then it just kept going from there, 10,000 copies, blah, 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 and, reprints and so forth. So, um, yeah, it was very well received to say the least. So,
Dare say it went viral in the 80s for a book. I mean, only that's pretty good for a story that was supposed to be banned. And that's usually, that's the power of written word, of oral word. Like when you hear a good story, it just gets passed on and you can't control how fast it gets spread. And so to hear 5,000 copies got bought within 12 days, like good, he had a story and it got out faster than what I'm sure they wanted to, and what he intended. So good for him.
Yeah. So at least a success story in that way. So yeah. Any last final thoughts before we move on to what we've been reading outside of our curriculum?
I mean, I think it's very interesting. Just and also, I mean, I had to kick myself for just how many countries are out there and how many stories and like the history of just how everyone works and views with each other. It is a universal thing, and it's a shame that's not taught. And it's a shame that's like if it doesn't affect us for the most part, not to be like reductive about it, but like if it doesn't affect us, we're not going to you know bother learning about it. And I think it should be. It's like stories like this is interesting and should be told, despite whether we were affected or not. So, and I think he gives hope and courage to those other people who are oppressed who may not have the means to, but have the ability to get their story out. He should. This it's a success story in that way, whereas stories that should be told whether or not they're banned or not.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I very much believe in like the sort of butterfly effect of it all, right? I mean, and one thing happens in part of the world, and if you don't think it affects you, all of a sudden now you're yelling about why your Amazon package isn't delivered on time. It's like, well, there's reasons for
Yeah.
that, you know?
Hmm.
Um, and so, yeah. All right. So that is This Earth of Mankind. All right. So I want to kick us off with what you've been reading off on the side.
Yeah, I just finished Remarkably Bright Creatures. Really good. I highly recommend it. And I also finished Even Though I Knew the End, which led me to another book that I'm going to like start today. Actually, I have it. Hold on.
As we hold on. Do, do, do,
Yeah,
do,
yes, yep.
do, do,
Joking.
do.
Editing. The Midnight Bargain, the same author as Even Though I Read It, I Knew the End. I like that story so much. I was like, let's keep going. And then for I haven't we haven't talked about our May decision, but I was torn between two different books. And of course, I got the other book too, just to read it. It's called Things We Lost to the Water. It's about a Vietnamese man going through some tragic loss in his family and the country and what he had to endure to get to where he is now. And so it was either that one or the other one that we will mention very briefly.
Well, yeah. So I had been reading The Tattooist of Auschwitz, which was, I kind of mentioned last time I finished it out. And yeah, it's one of those that obviously there's a lot of horrors in there, but the will and the sort of fighting human spirit that the characters are presented with, um, that's what you hang your hat on, right? And ultimately, while they went through so much, I mean, it's a love story, right? Um, it has a happy ending. So, I mean, as happy of an ending as one could, right? So,
Yeah.
spoiler alert. I mean, it's based on a real story. So they leave Auschwitz, they find each other, get married, live in Australia happily ever after, and so forth. So, yeah, I found it very intriguing, very well written, and I appreciated it for what it was. So that's about the only thing I've been reading. Just busy with other stuff, but moving forward, we've got, you want to introduce us?
Yeah, our March pick, which is my pick, There You'll Find Me, by Jenny B. Jones, based off. This is the book that inspired the movie Finding You. I figured, it's March, St. Patrick's Day, Irish, and we're going to Ireland, and so it's a story about a young musician trying to get more details about her brother's death and just trying to find herself. Before she sets herself up for her music career, she's just trying to figure out all these different aspects about her life. Really good. I finished it. I'm excited to talk about it. The movie's really good too, so go watch that. And then yeah, and then we have your choice.
Yeah, The Absolute True Diary of a Part-Time Indian by Sherman Alexie. So, we're going sort of lesser known cultures, but at least in the US, right? Talk about
Yeah.
things most people don't learn. Yeah, I don't know necessarily too much about this book, but it's been on my list for a while because I've been looking into, just good Native American books, and this keeps coming up on top of the list, or certainly within the top five. So I was like, all right, well, let's check it out,
Hmm.
because especially the title, The Absolute True Diary of a Part-Time Indian. Very fascinating title. So there you go.
Yeah. And then for May, which will be back to my which is, Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And me being, Filipino and Asian, I figured let's like pick a book within that realm. And so we're gonna be reading On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. This has been on my TBR for a while, and it finally gave me a good reason for us to read it. It's about another Vietnamese man, and his relationship with his mother and how they view the world, and him like really trying to find who he is, his masculinity, his sexuality, all that within the American space. So I'm excited to read it for our May month.
And then June is International Treasure Month. No, it's not, but it will be because we're going to be looking for treasure in Clive Cussler's book, Treasure. So this is, you guys know, this is a Dirk Pitt adventure. Dirk Pitt is, imagine like Hercule Poirot, imagine like a James Bond. It's one of those characters that Clive Cussler invented, except he's like, he works for kind of like an underwater, he's a nautical sort of person, right? So a lot of the adventure takes place underwater or in water. And I've read a lot of the various books. They're like the Tom Clancy novels, like they're fun, breezy. They're not really a strain. So it'll be the summer.
Okay.
Hopefully we have treasure as we read through Treasure.
Nice. Well, that sounds fun and adventurous.
Yeah.
Looking
So,
forward to it.
yeah, and it's definitely like written like one of those books, like with James Bond, he always gets the woman type of thing, and you know what I mean. So there's some mild sexism throughout, it's just so you can expect that.
There you go. Is it
Um,
is it like an individual one-off, or is it part of a series if this is like an established character?
so they're all one-offs, but there's reference that, I'm sure they always make a reference to, oh, this is Dirk Pitt, the guy who raised the Titanic. And it's like,
Mm,
do you need to have read Raise the Titanic to understand? No, you don't. But it's just a reference to that entire book.
got it.
So yeah, it's a
Oh,
lot like
fun.
that. Yeah. So that's what we got.
Yeah.
Thank you as always. Let us know what you thought of This Earth of Mankind. We look, forward to you joining us on future months. Marissa, where can people support you?
Everyone can follow me at Serafini TV.
And I'm at Phil Svitek, and I know this is going to be a very short-lived aspect of it, but I do have a crowdfund going for my latest project. The good news is, even if it's after the date, you'll get all the information there, so the link will be clickable. Now, what the hell is the link? Guess what? It's in the description. I made it easy for you because if I say it out, you'll never write it down, but it's in the description. So check it out. It's an animated movie that I think you guys will really enjoy. All right.
Go
Keep
fund
reading,
it.
everyone.